This presentation features work in progress towards my PhD in anthrozoology. Borrowing from participatory action research techniques, I'm working with Christina Zanotto, the self-monitored shark listener, who has dedicated 30 years to co-evolving and maintaining unconventional shark-human relationships with generations of sharks at a particular site in the Bahamas, where some of the relationships have lasted 15 years. The act of fishing for more than human animal bodies as a form of entertainment is an accepted and popular part of more than human animal recreational pastimes and tourist activities. While human friends and family members gather, ready for a fun day out of bonding, this normalised, often unquestioned, and fiercely defended activity directly aims to result in more than human animal injury or death. While recreational fishing is deemed as entertainment, relaxing and peaceful, the consequences to the prey is deemed by those who partake as collateral damage. Do anglers think of more than human animal family cohesion, destruction or grief encountered due to these societally acceptable actions? While we may not be ready to consider the breakup of families made up of only more than human animals, the grief of humans losing companion more than human animals is becoming less taboo. But what do you think about the case of fish, specifically sharks? I hand over to Christina.
For many, July 4th is a time of celebration. For me, the results of July 4th are of cleaning up. Every year after this weekend, sharks on Shark Junction come back covered in hooks. Yesterday was no exception. We went from 2 sharks with 2 small hooks to 6 sharks with new hooks and horrific metal line, one of them with a giant weight dragging below it. I was able to remove 2, one hook from Crook and one from Peggy. Nacho and Hook have massive lures coming out of their mouths. The hook is invisible, while Half-Baked has a hook with a line. A new girl we've been noticing for the last few weeks but not named yet also has a dragging line and lure, while Forficola had a line coming out of her gills. It is so upsetting that one weekend can go such a mess in a small population of protected sharks. I've been diving the same locations in the Bahamas for the last 30 years and formed a relationship between myself and a shiver of Caribbean reef sharks. I consider the sharks part of my family. They live 15 to 18 years. As I've been diving with them for 30 years, I've already lost some members of my family. One of the hardest things is not being able to say goodbye. While I've watched some sharks die from suspected cancer, others have simply not returned to the dive site. There are no goodbyes to my sharks. I do not know when I see them, whatever it may be, the last time. I wish I had an answer, even if I could just find them dead.
Some of the sharks have disappeared for over a year, then returned, meaning their absence creates extra anxiety as it may not be final. Regularly diving with sharks is a privilege Christina recognises and treasures. However, it takes a great deal of effort to organise funds, logistics and maintain a healthy body fit for scuba diving. Therefore, a casual fishing of a shark body has repercussions which are likely not even on the radar of concern of recreational fishers, even though many anglers have been shown to be interested in conservation. And catch and release has been promoted for decades as an anthropocentrically oriented attempt at conservation and sustainability. Abdullah et al. Explains how the more than human animal is disempowered in the tourist experience, as more than human animals don't enter the experience due to his or her own free will. Power and public perception are interconnected and reinforce marginalisation in tourism destinations, he says. Commercial fishing has long been accepted as having negative impacts on marine populations. However, over the last decade or so, questions have been asked about the effect of recreational fishing on marine populations. While commercial catches are in the main reported, this does not hold for marine recreational catches, of which only a few, if any, estimates are reported to the FAO. And while there's data deficiency, the tonnage of sharks and rays is estimated to average 900,000 tonnes a year. And while this is not converted to an estimate of individuals, Cameron et al. Say more than 66 million sharks were caught by recreational anglers in 10 years along the US Atlantic coast alone, including 1.2 million individuals of prohibited species.
The amount of hooks depends on the human presence. So in the winter time, we have less hooks, and in the summertime, we have more hooks because humans are more active in the ocean.
Christina shows me a box given to her in China, which is full of hooks that she's removed from the shiver over 20 years.
Nobody taught me how to remove hooks. I've started when I saw one of my sharks with a hook in her mouth, and it has evolved over time. Some sharks do not allow me to remove it. Some wait sometimes. Some let me try but swiftly swim away and come back a few seconds later, while some circle around me and they seem to pause, resting at an angle with their tail into the sand and allow me to try.
When I ask Christina if she feels that the sharks want the hooks removed, she says yes.
The sharks pause as if they say, come on, try to remove it. And then they swim away and then come back for another go. And they do this over and over again. The moment of pause allows me to attempt to remove the hook. I have developed different techniques depending on where the hook is embedded, if it has a weight or a line attached, how infected the area is. Some removals are a simple push-pull, a movement that I taught myself. I had a light bulb moment when I noticed the change in behavior before and after the hook removal. The connection with Foggy Eyes started in August 2013 when I removed a hook from her throat, and her behavior went from one of the most skittish to one of the most attached. Her and other sharks seek my attention and at times nestle into my chest and laugh.
When Christina and I talk about the effects of hooks on sharks, we talk about pain, injury, deformities, infection, and death. Looking for research into fishing hooks that remain in sharks, or retained fishing gear, as it's popularly referred to in shark biological academic language, there's a range of animal welfare implications, including injury and stress, from the process of capture, handling, often including removal from the water and exposure to air, and release. These impacts, say Cameron et al., can be broadly categorized as resulting from the physical injury and or the biochemical disruptions associated with this process, with consequences ranging from relatively minor short-term impairments to mortality. Cameron et al.'s diagram proposes categories of hooking consequences. What is not present in this diagram are sharks attempting self-removal or post-release removal of hooks by people such as Christina. Such data is potentially not sought and also not easy to capture. There is a paucity in shark pain research, and it is not mentioned explicitly in the articles I found on retained hooks. Physical injury, biochemical disruptions, and physiological stress response are the categories normally mentioned. Some articles even doubt fish feel pain, while others disagree, and some discuss how to treat pain in fish, albeit not in sharks. I asked Christina about shark pain after hooking.
I've seen quite a lot of hooks causing infections, deformities, and I know it's painful because it takes a very long time for a shark that shows up with a new hook to feed. Sharks who have had hooks removed before will allow me to remove hooks more easily than sharks that have never had a hook removed. The changes in their behavior tell me that over time, some of the initial pain might decrease, and I notice they start feeding. When the hooks really bothers them, they dive into the sand trying to remove it. Rarely they manage to dislodge the hooks. If I'm lucky, sometimes when I twist a hook hard enough, I can force them to readjust the jaw, and the hook may fall out, but it's very rare.
I couldn't find any academic documentation of sharks trying to dislodge or self-remove hooks. However, there is literature on hooks in sharks which illustrates hooking and hook retention creating injuries, infection, and death. First, let's quickly look at the type of hooks. Although there are a multitude of different hook types available to recreational anglers, these can usually be simplified to one of the two most common hook types, the traditional J-hook and the circle hook. There is a discussion amongst scholars about post-release survivability and mortality based on the hook type. J-hooks are considered easier to swallow and so get hooked in the digestive tract of marine life and are expected to cause more deaths, whereas circle hooks are believed to hook mainly outside the body in the jaws, fins, or gills, which supposedly lead to decreased post-release mortality. But does this correlate to findings? Well, there's not a lot of data. Santos et al. Acknowledged large gaps in data for retention and mortality rates for pelagic sharks. For the 40 relevant references they identified for pelagic sharks, they found mixed results when comparing retention rates of elasmobranchs caught on circle hooks relative to J-hooks in shallow pelagic longlines. A 2023 study on catch and release consequences on sharks also revealed large data gaps, with only 23 catch and release studies identified on carchariniforms, 12 studies on lamniforms, 4 on ragiforms, 3 on rhinopristiforms, and 1 on orectobleiforms. Cameron et al. Say other elasmobranch orders, including squaliforms and scrutiniforms, were not found to be represented by any catch and release studies, revealing more gaps in research in the effect of hooks on sharks. Within studies on the effects of retained hooks in sharks, hooks have been found swallowed and caught in the gut, bleeding caused by gill injury, damage to the esophagus and internal organs, such as lacerated livers and chronic health issues. A 2017 case shows a sand tiger death due to internal hemorrhaging from a circle hook lodged in the stomach. Another complication is that hooks migrate. Examples in literature show hooks can be inside the shark's body long enough to become mineralized, forming what is called an enterolith. These hooks migrate through the body's walls, for example, stomach to intestines, with the lines sometimes attached, leading to, in the case of an emaciated nurse shark caused by the mineralized hook and line, the invasion of GI tract bacteria into the systemic circulation and abdominal cavity, leading to infection and disease in line with previous studies. Nurse sharks can be particularly susceptible to hooking meant for teleosts, leading to sharks being released with hooks in their GI tract, causing localized tissue trauma, bacterial infection, chronic pathologies, and ultimately death. The 2021 paper says this is the first description of a hook-shaped enterolith in any marine animal, but we wonder how many marine animals are actually affected. Sharks found emaciated are described as having become anorexic due to migrated retained hooks, which can cause infection and or blockage, or fistulas, with no food found in the GI tract of sharks having been documented at least twice in literature. Experiments where sharks have been deliberately starved and fasted show they ingest small amounts of seawater, and this seawater helps mineralize the hook. Otway says, the absence of food items, GI tract stasis, and the occurrence of monohydrocalcite in the enterolith suggests a history of seawater drinking and anorexia in the stranded shark. My understanding is that the hook went into the stomach, migrated into the intestine, perforating the boundary between the stomach and the intestine, creating bacteria in the GI tract and therefore infection. So the shark couldn't eat enough and starved, therefore ingesting seawater, which in part created the enterolith. In 2002, 6 blue sharks were found to have hooks embedded within the distal esophagus, perforating the gastric wall and lacerating the liver. These hooks were surrounded by excessive fibronecrotic tissue, which eroded the normal anatomical structures. All sharks had peritonitis and bacterial infection. A case in 2015 illustrates how a retained circle hook had migrated to the heart, where an embolism and cardiac collapse was the likely cause of death after debilitating disease, prevented the shark from feeding and culminated in stranding. There are only 2 reported cases I could find of hooks being surgically removed from live sharks, one of which was an aquarium captive shark. One had a hook removed from the liver in 2011. Another had a hook removed from the esophagus in 2016. External hooking seems to be minimalised, marginalised, and no mention of pain post-release. For example, some authors talk about superficial injuries and negative impacts such as tissue necrosis being less severe. However, for some species, external hooking does not help. In the case of the common thresher shark, they are normally caught by the caudal fin, which reduces their ability to ram ventilate, or in layman's terms, breathe during the fishing fight. This brings me to 2 thoughts. How can Christina remove the hooks if she can't see them? Hooks have to be visible and accessible. She mentions some sharks have become emaciated, which makes me think they may have ingested hooks, which may have migrated. And how many sharks are affected? Well, there's a gap in data on long-term consequences and the number of sharks affected. Cameron et al. In their paper conclude there has been comparatively little research on long-term consequences of recreational angling, such as those stemming from hook retention. Beyond the obvious expense and difficulty associated with prolonged monitoring periods, any assessment of the wider population level impact is also likely to be hampered by a lack of available information on the rates of hook retention for most recreational fisheries targeting elasmobranchs. They go on to say most reported hook retention rates come from experimental studies. So longitudinal studies on hooking effects are rare. How can effects be known if sharks with hooks are not tracked? And how long does it take sharks to die from internal or external hooking? Well, Christina, as mentioned, has been diving with and removing hooks from the same sharks for a number of years and has first-hand knowledge on the effects on the shiver. Perhaps there's potential for a deeper study on the hooking effects on the sharks that she has unconventional relationships with. Here she talks about Grandma as an example.
Grandma is an 8 foot 10 inches, 2-meter long shark whom I've been diving with for 13 years and has a permanent injury in the lower jaw. This distinct feature is the most identified mark on Grandma. It has not always been there. It appeared 5 years ago. The flesh around the bottom jaws is slightly pulled back, showing the teeth in their entirety and created a permanent infection. Grandma seems to deal with it pretty well. At times, the infection is bigger, at times, it's smaller, but it never goes away. One of the theories behind this stretch is that a hook became stuck in the area and pulled hard enough to leave the damage.
Other sublethal consequences are physiological stress and trauma due to the constant fight of retrieval. However, the fight is considered part of the fun in the recreational fishing pastime. As Christina points out, sharks are not a game to play with. They fight for their lives as someone on the boat is having a great time. So sharks may return with visible or invisible hooks or recreational fishing-induced stress, and today Crook is not settling.
Crook is another of my long-term resident sharks that comfortably sits in my lap, yet recently her energy has changed drastically and appears extremely uncomfortable, resting in my lap only for mere seconds before leaving.
Christina gives another example of how sharks in the Shiver are negatively affected by being hooked.
Hook, who is a shark I've known for 13 years, was without a hook on a Monday and showed up on a new hook on Thursday. That day, she initially stayed at the edge of the circle, seemingly distressed outside of a regular comfort zone.
In addition, these sharks are hooked again and again. Multiple hooks in one shark have been noted in literature where over 7.6 years multiple hooks come and go and one remains retained. And in pelagic sharks, longline fishers and observers often report catching sharks with several, up to 7, longline hooks embedded in their jaws, suggesting individuals survive multiple interactions with fishing gear. And high bite-off rates, for example 33% of total shark catches in pelagic longline fisheries, may result in millions of hooks embedded in sharks worldwide. Christina has removed multiple hooks from multiple sharks, and we are working on a log of how many and how often with which sharks. Again, this multiple hooking makes us question how many other individuals, how many times, and where are sharks hooked. Sharks in the Bahamas are protected, and yet they are still fished and still hooked. There's no data on how far they travel. Do they go into waters where they're not protected? None of the sharks are tagged, and it's not possible to tell from the hooks where the hooks were purchased. However, sharks are fished not only accidentally but illegally in the Bahamas, as shown by a case in 2020 where an American family holidaying there boasted on social media how they deliberately fished and barbecued a shark, and they were only sorry when they were caught. For Christina, the emotional reaction is very different.
For the world, you may be one person, or for one person, you may be the world. This is how I feel when I remove hooks from sharks. I know I'm making the difference for that one shark, one hook at a time, and that to me means the world. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to clean up a little mess. 3 hooks, one double hook with a 250-gram weight attached to it. Life is made of small, meaningful actions.
But unfortunately, life is also made up of meaningless, thoughtless actions, and families fishing sharks for entertainment, bragging and bonding may have consequences for the non-grievable and those that love them. A shark is fished, killed. It's just a shark. The shark can no longer return to the life he or she had or to those in his or her life. When I ask Christina how she copes with sharks that do not return, if she has any kind of remembrance ritual, whether she says goodbye internally, she says,
I keep looking into the blue, hoping that I can see her swimming back. I do this every day, until I think she's gone. And then maybe one day I make my peace with it. I just wish I had an answer, even if it means finding her body dead on the ocean floor. In reality, I never have closure. I would love to know if she went somewhere else or if she died. But in the end, I can never say goodbye to my sharks.
This ambiguous loss, almost exclusively applied to human scenarios, is defined as being caused when loved ones suddenly vanish, leading to an unresolved grief. Boss says this leaves the grieving in a frozen state, both stressful and often tormenting. No ritual to say goodbye, as hope amplifies guilt and slices through any attempt to ritualize a form of closure. Scholars also write about disenfranchised grief, and society creates spaces and mechanisms for people to mark and grieve the loss of more than human animals that were significant to them. However, while cats and dogs are firmly accepted into the worth grieving for category of more than human animals, some societies are beginning to accept humans may grieve for other species. Such species as guinea pigs, hamsters, rats, jumping spiders, and even some reptiles are creeping into the fringes. Even pet fish have started to make the grade of being grievable. Being grievable is a term Butler neologized to mean those who are eligible to be grieved, when their deaths will be marked or mourned. It may seem odd for anyone to find a shark eligible for being grievable. However, as we have seen, Christina thinks sharks are most definitely eligible to be grieved. Just as she considers the dog she lives with as part of her multi-species family, she too considers sharks she has relationships with as kin. So Christina contends with both forms of grief, and to compound the situation, her bodily status as a female in a male-dominated industry even further closes any space within which she feels she can freely express her grief, as gender-enforced roles marginalise women. So as we have seen, in what was once considered a harmless pastime, recreational as well as commercial fishing is being slowly shown to have profound effects. And while there is limited data regarding the post-release survival of hooked sharks, there's arguably even less regarding unknown numbers of hooks remaining in or on shark bodies. A question we have is whether, just as a 2020 study on tiger sharks at a shark ecotourism site off Tahiti claimed, this study demonstrates that shark ecotourism data can provide unique insights into the long-term fate of residual hooks in free-ranging sharks that cannot be achieved to date using other methods. Can Christina's longitudinal relationship with sharks in the Bahamas have potential to do the same? In the meantime, Christina looks out for the shiver, maintaining the co-developed unconventional relationships through hook removal.
Grandma is late to the dive again.
I look into the blue.